Morning. Good morning, everyone. It is with great pleasure to welcome all of you to this symposium. It is organized by the gallery to pursue the lines of conversation sketched out by the exhibition Tropical. As we further reflect on the ideas and methods proposed by the exhibition, I'm sure we will be prompted to consider more perspectives by our speakers who have contributed sharply, if not fundamentally, to redefining what it means and what it takes to internally and extensively transform the order of things in art and the entire ecology around it. Across the fields of art history, artistic practice, and curation, Professor Partha Mitter, Solange Farkas, Atriya Gupta, Yuki Kihara, Isa Hoxon, and Venuri Pereira will speak to matters that make a project like Tropical necessary, and to possibilities that fulfill the promise of tropicality, which includes translation, geopoetics, interspecies sensing, and the various turns in writing and worlding. As they offer their thoughts, the curators of the exhibition, Shabir Hussain Mustafa, Theo Hiwi Min, Cheng Jayun, and Chini Lim will initiate discussions to touch more nerves in thinking through sensible forms in a sensitive environment. The symposium is in many ways a supplement, a way to address the gaps of the exhibition, as well as the insufficiency of the exhibitionary enterprise. No one exhibition can possibly encompass the universe of implications that render exhibitions like Tropical urgent in the first place, and that the exhibition as a medium is in itself a site of limits. In the spirit of constant revisions as evoked by the tropical atmosphere and the work of the tropic, the exhibition and symposium can only anticipate more initiations in the future regarding the art historical imagination of the regions referred to as Southeast Asia and Latin America, and the more complex ways of annotating a prospective South-to-South relationship. Trite as it may sound, the exhibition is only the beginning, and as in all initial efforts, it is productively fraught, uneven, marked by blind spots and disproportions in research, but nevertheless decisively engaged, entangled in timely problematizations. I must also add that the exhibition Tropical, perhaps in the same breath, has elicited deep introspection and generous wonder and excitement among specialists and the general public. An important aspect of the relationship underlying the geographies of Southeast Asia and Latin America is the method of comparison or juxtaposition or convergence or solidarity. In this regard, art history has invested in specific techniques so that the unruly congeries of expressions and impulses are brought together and made coherent under recognizable rubrics. Such an exercise has yielded legibility, one that in the long term has become quick and convenient and would inevitably harden into an orthodoxy or a canon. On the other hand, the said legibility could open up to questions about the tricky conditions of representation, the desire for inclusion, the repositioning of the periphery, and the restitution of the global majority through lateral choreographies like the one we glean in Tropical. Needless to say, the National Gallery Singapore constantly struggles with the said pressures as it aspires to perform global modernism as a curatorial and museological project. In light of this multitude of anxieties, we turn to the wisdom of the years and the responsiveness of a persistent and punctual practice in art history. We are honored today to present a keynote lecture by the esteemed Professor of Art History, stalwart mentor, and inspiring writer Partha Mitter, who will remark upon the problems of a mutating canon in art history, the implications of its disciplinal hegemony, and its underlying political, if not colonial, structure, and the various challenges to its overdeterminations. One of his propositions is the virtual cosmopolis, which may redistribute the valences of art and history as we know it, and decenter a modernism that has generated shifting situations of control and refusal. It is interesting to view the virtual cosmopolis in relation to the positivist metropolis of the nation-state that has in many ways circumscribed the historiography of art, the consciousness of culture, and the fantasy of nation, and its attendant National Gallery of Modern and Contemporary Art. Professor Mitter studied history at London University and did his doctorate with the eminent E.H. Gombrich in 1970. In 1974, he joined the University of Sussex as a lecturer in Indian history, retiring in 2002 as professor in art history. His touchstone publications include Much Maligned Monsters, History of European Reactions to Indian Art, Art and Nationalism in Colonial India, 1850 to 1922, Occidental Orientations and the Triumph of Modernism, India's Artists and the Avant-Garde, 1922 to 1947. At present, he is Emeritus Professor in Art History, University of Sussex, member of Wolfson College, Oxford, and Honorary Fellow, Victoria and Albert Museum in London. So please help me warmly welcome to the stage Professor Partha Mitter.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for those kind words. Hello, everybody. Now, one thing I must warn you, my voice breaks in the middle often, so probably just have a sip of water. I hope I'll revive after that. Now, just a few words before I begin. I published this essay in 2008 called Decentering Modernism in the American art journal, Art Bulletin, and it has drawn the attention of artists, art historians, and critics around the world, giving rise to engaging debates, which I'm very grateful for. In particular in Brazil, so just to mention that, Singapore, been here about 3 times, Eastern and Central European art historians. So since then, I've been thinking quite a bit. I want to offer you my recent thinking that has tried to enlarge my original thesis on decolonization. I call it decentering modernism, decolonization by another name, because otherwise it becomes a rhetoric. Now, let me ask you, begin by asking you a fundamental question. Why do we need to reimagine modernism from a transcultural perspective? I would say that this is necessary in the present global world. And I also mention transcultural perspective simply because modernism seems to have become an inclusive global concept in our time. Now, the heterogeneous character of the end of contemporary global art practices has even given rise to anxiety about the end of history as a grand Hegelian narrative. Particularly Hans Belting has talked about that. So the disjuncture between awareness of an enormous diversity of art forms and the narrow focus of canonical art histories. But let's look around. International biennales, triennales, now religiously feature select artists from the peripheries as evidence that artists all over the world now share certain common values. Do they really? Rather than being universal, these values, I would argue, are in fact the product of Western modernism and its special claims to universality. Of course, much has changed, especially the emergence of contemporary artists from the non-Western world, not to mention the diaspora artists within the West, many of whom are actively engaged in challenging the exclusive canon of modernism. Now, let's see. Yeah. So my very close friend, Rashid Al-Ryan, produced this compelling exhibition, The Other Story, in 1989, really rubbished initially by lots of English critics. It was very important. First time gave voice to the periphery within British society. And now look around us. Recent curators, I must say, mark a significant departure. Catherine David's ambitious retrospective of the great Afro-Cuban painter Wilfredo Lam in 2016 at the Centre Pompidou in Paris. This was the very first of this great surrealist. And then you had Chris Durkin at Tate Modern, and he did this great retrospective, of the works of Ibrahim El Salahi, a visionary African modernist from Sudan. And it was such an important thing, example of his work, as well as it sort of continued with, I go back to this, Stefani D'Alessandro and Matthew Gale's very important exhibition at the Met, New York, and Tate Modern, Surrealism Beyond Borders. And finally, decentering of the Bauhaus Foundation. And I was very grateful they invited me to engage in this process in a series of international exhibitions a century after his birth in Weimar, which was 1919. So we had our last exhibition in 2019. I have been personally involved with the Bauhaus for 10 years. So perhaps you could say with impunity that the process of dismantling the canon has begun. This is good news. But the bad news is that the change has been extremely slow. It's also marginal, despite the serious efforts of the new groups of scholars and curators. So I would say there continues to be a pressing need to decenter modernism and challenge the linear view of art history, centering on Europe. So what's the current situation? Well, to put it very bluntly, our own discipline, art history lags behind other developments. Before that, I want to mention something which I've always felt is very important to remember, that as opposed to discourse of modernism, modernity as such is a wider historical phenomenon which unleashed political, economic, and social forces that wrought great changes in human history, both materially and intellectually. It had begun the 19th century, we know, the steamships, telegraph, and so on. This was marked by transport and communication revolutions, which has continued, of course, to today, and World Wide Web, and large, and that's the important thing to remember, population displacement. That was tragic as well as very momentous. Then scientific and industrial revolutions gave rise to new social formations in Europe. But overseas expansion took Europeans to other parts of the world. And of course, in our post-colonial period, this has come to be known as globalization. Capitalism, the cornerstone of modernity, rests on the mutual dependence of the center and the periphery with regard to raw materials and markets. A sort of link here, really interrelated. But of course, today we know an urgent issue, shifting of geopolitical balance of power, with the growing influence of BRICS countries. A little while ago, it's to be called, it's still grown. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Of course, not to mention Asian tigers, including Singapore, of course, as we know, the hub of world trade. This has had an important impact on the art market, as demonstrated by the proliferation of, again, art fairs, biennales, art auctions. Very important. Zippies, children of Indian and Chinese capitalism, who are the heroes of Thomas Friedman's rather controversial book, The World is Flat. They have been quite major players in auction houses and so on. But what I'm going to tell you now, and that I mentioned the bad news, such momentous changes, and they were taking place, has had little effect on perception of non-Western modernism. Think about it. Even today, leading non-Western artists seldom feature in standard art history textbooks. And the very important one, Art Since 1900. I'm afraid I have been guilty of being very critical of this book. The modernist canon continues to be a closed discourse. That's the thing. That tends to erase non-Western art from art history. Why are they seen as marginal? Derivative character of non-Western art. Time lag. Judgment that continues to exert its power in representations of the art of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. But I would say this fails to recognize the significant developments in non-Western art in the 20th century. This is our last century, of course. Now today we are in 21st century. Let me cite just from my own field of study, Jamini Roy, the Indian modernist, 1887-1972, for instance, produced great works of, power and simplicity that seriously challenge the capitalist colonial ideology of the British Empire. And in the international conference recently, this was very interesting. One of the Indian participants said, "But why didn't you have Jamini Roy?" So the organizer said, "Look, Jamini is a local artist, and American students will understand him." Very interesting. Okay. Now, omission of artists from the regions outside the West is really simply a reflection of a wider problem. The common practice of equating Western norms with universal values. This is, of course, the inspiration of the great German philosopher Immanuel Kant, his view of aesthetics. Art is regarded as neutral, disinterested, but I would say it systematically ignores implications of race, gender, sexual orientation, and even class in art history. So in order to grasp the problem, we need to probe more deeply, closely, the universalist claims of the Western canon, originating in the Enlightenment, of course, the 18th century. This is a concealed hierarchy implicit in the modernist discourse and its impact on contemporary art of regions of the so-called periphery, I think can only be explained in historical terms. Let's not forget the rise of art history as a discipline coincided with European expansion overseas. It's very interesting, late 18th century. Johann Joachim Winckelmann. The colonial powers sought to impose what they call good taste in the subject nations. It was done in India, which I personally know, through the inculcation of academic naturalism and classical standards of taste. And I show you Leonardo da Vinci, one of the great paintings, and he was the epitome of the, you might say, the conquest of representation in the Renaissance. So I'm going to use him several times. However, in the 19th century, the avant-garde revolution in the West challenged academic art, as well as bourgeois values and aesthetic ideals. To take an example of Picasso, self-portrait, African mask, and of course, African art became very important, very much challenging Western classical norms. But these sentiments, and we mustn't forget that, and are coming from India originally, these sentiments shaped art and literature worldwide. We're all affected by it. And few societies remain immune to this. the worldwide diffusion of Europe's cultural horizon in the so-called heroic age of the avant-garde can't be exaggerated. The modernist formal language and syntax of Cubism, and I'm going to talk about a little later about this, allowed artists around the globe to devise new ways of representing the visible world. And again, avant-garde revolt against academic naturalism was openly welcomed by us, you might say, original subject nations, who were engaged in formulating their own resistance to colonial order. Above all, modernism's experimental attitude. Its ideology of emancipatory innovation and its resistance to traditional authority released new energies outside the West from the kind of often, things were getting a bit, tired, and kind of old forms were really being discarded. But then let's take up the 1970s, a whole generation of radical critics, Marxist, postmodern, post-colonial art historians, have helped reduce the triumphalism of the avant-garde, highlighting the fractures and contradictions of modernity, all of which inspired global art practices. While granted the central importance of modernism and its radical critics such as T.J. Clark and Rosalind Krauss, the discipline, and that's the thing, the discipline of art history is yet to question, and that's what I always insist with my art historian friends, yet to question in any serious manner the implicit acceptance of non-Western modernism as derivative or provincial. I take an example from an artist in colonial India, my own work, as well as a very favorite painting of mine, very difficult name, Gagananda Tagore, the great poet's nephew, 1867-1938. He was actually the first painter to adapt the revolutionary syntax of Cubism to produce very small postcard size series of small jewel-like paintings. I have talked about that in my book, Triumph of Modernism. And this was between the years 1921-28. But if I talk about this, let me explain to you what actually Cubism meant to the world. Why did it spread around the world? What was so important? And that we mustn't forget. What was the revolution? 1919, 1911. Analytical Cubism, that's the term used, developed jointly by Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque, rapidly spread around the world. But what was it all about? I want to quickly explain to you what I mean. Let's go back to, first let me go back to, take the Cubist image. Picasso, portrait, very interesting, can't even see what the person is like. Why is this? I will go back one more, back to Leonardo da Vinci. Now, if you look at it carefully, Renaissance painting in natural light, always light, sunlight, natural light, or any light, hits the object from one direction. Why? This was in order to create a solid form. So you have that. Then what else did Leonardo use? Of course he used perspective, single points perspective, going all the way. But not only, and light and shade, chiaroscuro. But he was very clever. And that is one of the things we must think about. Why is, and I've always asked myself, why is Leonardo's painting always the background is bathed in mist. Why is it always misty? Italy is full of bright sunshine, so why is it like that? The very good reason. By making that so misty, you're creating a distance. And that's a very interesting point. These are the things, and also foreshortening. These are the things that Leonardo and others, a whole range of Renaissance artists, perfected. So you might call conquest of space, conquest of representation. Now, if you look carefully, and this had little bit to do with photography, Picasso deliberately has created conflicting light sources. They are not from one side. What happens? It dissolves the form. And that was something which analytical cubism did. Right from all the way to Giotto to, you might say, Impressionists, all look real. Cézanne started to challenge it, but it was Picasso and Braque who actually destroyed this form. So do you see? That was the great revolution, and everybody loved it. However, there's an interesting caveat. I'm coming to that. Just 1 second. Yeah. Okay. Interestingly enough, Picasso and Braque found that analytical cubism too difficult. They then moved to, you might call what's called synthetic cubism, which is decorative. What did other artists, right from France, Germany, Europe, Russia, all the way through India, Japan, and so on, what did they actually like? They were drawn to cubism's distortion and fragmentation, and could be put to different usage than to this formal revolution of analytical cubism. He this is Jörg Grosch, German expressionist, cartoonist. He is representing he was a very important communist leader, Oskar Panizza, his funeral. And what actually Grosch wanted to do was to bring out the violent revolutionary challenge to capitalism that could only be expressed through the fragmented syntax of cubism. So that's one thing he did. Let's look at Gogolnath again. He is very interested in, you can see here, Gogolnath, he wanted to create dazzling, ambiguous patterns in his lyrical work through distortions, fragmentations. So I would suggest the motivation behind Western expressionists such as Jörg Grosch and Indian Gogolnath Tagore was similar. But even though these artists shared a formal language, the specific cultural context of Central European and Indian artists were, of course, very different, as were their artistic aims. Context is always important. So what did they represent? These artists reflected the decontextualizing tendency of modernity, shared globally. Armchair traveler, styles past and present could be appropriated generate striking new meanings. You don't have to go anywhere. Now, let's come to art criticism, colonial criticism. W.G. Archer, an important art historian, English art historian, he wrote on Gogolnath Tagore. And his view was Picasso's use of African sources didn't compromise his integrity as a European artist, identity. But Indian artists' use of cubism, like this man, resulted in the loss of self as a colonial hybrid. Terrible problem. Archer, in fact, represents this complex discourse, the colonial discourse, power, authority, and hierarchy. In the evaluation of the non-Western avant-garde. This is what I've called Picasso Manqué syndrome. Artist analysis of modern art rests on a reductive criteria. Successful imitation is a form of aping. But imperfect imitation amounts to a failure of learning, the Picasso Manqué syndrome. Now I want to suggest ways of challenging this, going to different ways. These exchanges of styles and technology needn't necessarily be interpreted through ideas of domination and dependence. Rudolf Wittkower, the great authority on ancient migration and ancient symbols, traced the fascinating story of how ancient West received and transformed images from the ancient Orient. No problem there. Nobody's saying, oh, they're derivative. So, if we turn to the present, the advent of modernism in Asia, Africa, and Latin America could thus be profitably studied as part of the global processes of cross-fertilization, the interaction, interface. So how can we reconfigure art history for the present century, today, 21st century? And that's what I'm very interested in. But before that, let me unpack one of the key concepts in art history. I'm allergic to it. I'll come to it. Influence. Artistic influence acquired a special significance for colonial art historians. They're obsessed with tracing the Western grammar of non-Western modernism, including Guggenheim and Archer, ranking them within an evolutionary world order. It's the 19th century favorite exercise. The late Michael Baxendale spoke of the obsession with stylistic influence as a curse. Why? Because it tended to diminish artistic agency, because artists had a choice in the production of art. Responding to circumstance, the artist makes a conscious selection. You mustn't forget that agency from a range of sources. But, and that's where I come to more political aspects, let's say, the modernist canon embraces a great deal more than influence. Its powerful notion of teleology, artistic progress, constructs a whole world of inclusions and exclusions. Linear art history boasts a long tradition, and we need to go back to the 16th century art historian Giorgio Vasari. He created the master narrative for Renaissance art. He loved Florence, Rome, and Venice, particularly Florence. And this was, of course, based on conquest of visual representation. Back to Leonardo. Okay. His favorite, Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, perfect art. Vasari defined Florence, Rome, and Venice as centers of innovation, categorizing other regions in Italy as sites of delayed growth and imitation. And Parmigiano and others, wonderful painters, dismissed. In addition, Vasari dismissed all other European nations, put them in the backward category. This was taken over by our father of art history, German art historian Joachim Winckelmann, and he consolidated these prejudices. He took climatic, national, and racial differences in art as objective facts. So that's one of the things, and I'm now going to put to you the hierarchy, the difference. Now, despite its revolutionary intentions, this is, I'm thinking of modernism, set against the originary discourse of the metropolis, Paris, perhaps Berlin, Munich, New York, and so on, other modernisms were marginalized as suffering from a time lag. A very important thing. Always slightly delayed, trying to catch up. So, in short, center-periphery relationship is not one of geography, but of power and authority, with modernism creating its own tacit exclusions and inclusions. But as the art historian Keith Moxey reminds us, the modernist teleology constructs a time zone that excludes other times. Thus, non-Western modernisms operate on times different from that of the progressive West. Conclini, the art critic in Latin America, has talked quite a bit about that, getting in and out of modernity. So basically, non-Western modernisms operate on times different from that of the progressive West. And this view of history, not just art, view of history was poignantly expressed by the great Mexican poet Octavio Paz. In his speech, when he accepted the Nobel Prize, he agonizes over incommensurate times of the center and the periphery, as seen to suffer from a delayed time. I can do no better than quote him. I quote, "In spite of what my senses told me, the time over there, belonging to the others, was the real one. The time of the real present, lived by others, the English, the French, and the Germans. It was a time of New York, Paris, London." So, coming back to our problem, if we discard stylistic influence as a meaningful category, what other theoretical tools can we deploy to make sense of the transmission of ideas across cultures that are not predicated on center-periphery imbalance? I did mention shifting balance of geopolitical power, but apart from economic and other arguments, which aren't trivial, are there further intellectual justifications for the center to recognize the periphery? I think I would say for that we need to readjust our mindset. Colonial discourse represents cultural intersections as a linear process. Waterfall, I love this analogy. It's seen as a waterfall, ideas forever flowing downwards from the West to the rest. But let's think, it's in fact not true. It's the multi-directional flows of culture that has been the known fact of history. So there have been a lot of writings, as you know, including Homi, so on. We can learn from recent critical art theories, art history, as well, which offer us strategies of empowerment through new readings of modernism in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. I'm coming to this in a minute. That destabilized the Western canon. But above all, this is Rivera from Mexico, but above all, we need to dismantle the teleology of the modernist canon and stop viewing Western modernism as a universal category that transcends time and space. Why I show this, hybridity is very important, hybridity, and various people have written about it, including Homi. But often when you have national expression, national identity, the reverse work, we need to think of also of how do you fit into the whole modernist canon. And hybridity doesn't work there because to Rivera, this is Mexican past and very much an identity question. Going back to the West, we mustn't forget, and I love, we all do great achievements of Western masters, as well as Western avant-garde. but they can be treated historically within their own set of conventions. So we shouldn't privilege, without privileging any art in particular, not even Western modernism and original discourse, we may investigate art practices in their social and cultural settings, taking into account the regional contextual needs, the local assertions of global concerns. So I would say we need to develop this more inflected narrative of global modernity that offers us a possible way of restoring artists' agency in all the regions outside the West in the context of colonial empires. By analyzing art practices as a cultural document, that's very important, rooted in its own context. One serious problem with influence as an analytical tool is that it views artists as passive agents of transmission rather than active agents with the ability to exercise choice. In my particular field of study, Indian modernism, I've tried to show that it can be meaningfully mapped within the context of nationalist resistance to the British Empire. I'm now reaching several difficult concepts, and I'll put it to you. I'm still work in progress in my case. So I'll try and articulate what I mean. First of all, I've been developing what I call the concept of the virtual cosmopolis to explain the critical engagement of the colonized and the periphery with modernity. I don't have much time just to put to you the bare bones of the argument. So let's think one by one. First, European colonial expansion introduced major hegemonic languages in different regions, such as the languages were English, French, and Spanish Portuguese, different spheres of influence. And these were in the periphery. How were these languages transmitted? And that's very interesting. Circulated through print culture. Might call print capitalism, but it's the print technology, exporting not only texts worldwide, but also images from the West to the non-West. So I'd like to imagine, I think of Calcutta, but it could be Buenos Aires, it could be Cairo, the individual, let's say scholar, whatever, seated in the study in the periphery, Calcutta or Buenos Aires, doesn't have to travel the world to receive ideas of modernity. The real cosmopolitans usually have a lot of money, ability to travel around the world. But they haven't got probably money, but they receive printed text as virtual cosmopolitans, books, journals, printed images. I look at one of the ideas developed by Benedict Anderson with nationalism. He had coined the phrase, imagine community, to explain the idea of nationalism. He's only interested in that. It's a limited interest. But for me, it's very interesting. We can profitably extend it on the global level to explain the circulation of print culture. I will tell you, give you an example of one very famous case, and I've been at a conference, I've written about it as well. The celebrated case is the English comic magazine, The Punch, which actually was one of the best-known publications around the world. Now, I don't know if you've seen Punch, rather conservative, even the humor is very limited English. But when Punch went abroad to India, to Middle East, the West Asia, to East Asia, all parts of the world, they change. And I know about India, other places, they became revolutionary, radical ways of challenging colonialism. So that had a tremendous indirect influence. So, again to say, virtual cosmopolitan was that armchair traveler and part of a hybrid imagined community that engendered, I call it elective affinities between the center and the periphery. But on the level of the imagination, of course, there's a hitch there. The problem of power and authority, that power and authority confer visibility. You are known around the world. And inclusion couldn't be wished away. What happens to these people on the margins? But I would suggest asymmetrical power relations doesn't preclude the fecund cross-fertilization of ideas. But we can't deny power and authority. And, visibility, inclusion on the metropolis. However, still we can have cross-fertilization of ideas within the cosmopolis, within the virtual cosmopolis. So, there's been a lot of controversy about cosmopolitanism. Antony Appiah, the philosopher, talks about cosmopolitanism. But it's a privileged view that everyone has the right to share world heritage. But how about a poor woman in a remote village in, I don't know, Ghana perhaps, or, Madhya Pradesh in India? Can they share all the wealth of the cultural heritage of the world? They can't do that. And then there have been critics who say cosmopolitans from below, James Clifford and various other ones, that they come, they travel, refugees arrive this place, they're also cosmopolitans. Anyway, I'm not involved with that directly, that debate. So how can we make sense of, you might say, cultural border crossings that are not prejudged by the center-periphery imbalance? Here I found the Russian literary critic Mikhail Bakhtin. His ideas are very interesting, deeply inspiring. He takes the term dialogic from ancient Greece, Greek philosophers, to describe a continuous dialogue with other works of literature. He talks about how the process appropriates the world of others and transforms them according to one's creative intention. And thus, this leads to new ideas generated. And he calls it an intertextual process within a field of literature, if you take that as a kind of field. A dynamic system engaged in endless redescriptions of one's world vision. Now, what Bakhtin applies to text could be a very useful tool for us, for our cross-cultural analysis of artistic transmission. So what's particularly important and the merit of dialogic method, that it allows for the coexistence of different approaches in a relativist way. It doesn't kind of glorify essentialist hierarchy, which is, of course, colonial discourse. Now, until now, I've been talking about how Western ideas were transmitted to other regions outside the West. But supposing we apply such virtual encounters to the West, encounter to West taking from other cultures, these are recently constantly being rightly studied, that African art, totally forgotten. Picasso's debt to African art, it's just affinity, no connection. It just, they worked the same way, so that Picasso can never take from anybody else. Very important role of Indian philosophy, Upanishads, Gita, in Kandinsky. He was absolutely so excited about this. Malevich, Mondrian. And I've read this and I've been engaged in debate with this. Art historians, no, it's the European rationalism that's more important. It doesn't matter. So, this is an interesting problem, needs to be developed further, and I'm also very interested in this. But let me end with an example, not from art, but let's turn to literature. Now, Westernization is a very important phenomenon of Asia, Africa, other places, and of course it's part of school book history. Yeah. Now, long time ago it was seen as a passive act, but then the political scientists began to say such acculturation, as well as anthropologists, not a passive act, but a selective process. A society becomes, in fact, receptive to ideas from outside when old paradigms no longer convince. But also, the agency comes in. What's assimilated from outside must be in keeping with that society's own values and cultural needs. We all know this. What's less known is that similar process of selective assimilation of ideas from outside were also going on in the West, and that isn't really recognized. And I'm going to give you a major example. The reception of Indian thought in 19th century America. The American thinkers known as transcendentalists, Walt Whitman, Walter Emerson, and Henry David Thoreau, were engaged in creating a new intellectual tradition based on their reading of Indian sacred texts, the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita. It was part of their endeavor to free themselves from the limitations of European positivist philosophy. I mean, if you read Walt Whitman, Passage to India, and he talks about his imaginary journey to India. He never actually visited India. It was all in the mind. You read Thoreau, Walden, Pure Waters, as a lot of reference to Ganges. And many of you may have seen Oppenheimer. Remember when the bomb was detonated? Oppenheimer quotes from the Bhagavad Gita, "I'm become death, I'm the destroyer of worlds." So it had a very powerful impact. What I want to put to you, the reception of Indian philosophy among Americans shouldn't be dismissed, and it's not totally different from the impact of the Enlightenment on 19th century Indians. They were indeed two sides of the same coin. What was happening? Both Indian and American intellectuals were operating within a virtual cosmopolis. It's a book, it's a reading, and being inspired and ideas. This process generated a mode of dialogic conversation across cultures, giving rise to the production of new ideas. I also looked at Jamini Roy, I mentioned. He was very interested in what I call primitivism as a critique of colonial urban culture. And you see totally unconnected, same time, in Germany, German primitivists, Karl Einstein, Wilhelm Hausenstein, were talking in similar terms. Alienation because of capitalism, urban alienation. And Roy was talking about colonial alienation. They didn't know, they'd never heard of each other, ever. Roy never ventured out of his place in Calcutta. So what were they doing? This is a structural affinity in response to capitalism. So I want to wrap up now. So at the moment, rightly, radical artists contemporary art, capital C, capital A, the burden of history and the hegemonic canon have led to the extremes of denying history altogether at the expense of coherence and context. A lot of contemporary art is very keen on time and history, and they are critiquing it very much. But I would suggest that solution to the limitation of art history cannot come overnight. So let me conclude with a reiteration. I do not share the belief that the end of linear art history spells the end of art history as such. What we need is a working hypothesis towards creating a more plural and inclusive art history that doesn't at the same time destroy the great achievements of the past. And that's what I hope the younger generation would do. I mean, that's why I feel very optimistic about. Thank you.